U.S. society, and I will gloss them here as the U.S. ruling elite.
Okay, and I usually look at that as being, say, for example, the State Department, which, although we have had administrations come and go, I think the State Department has had a pretty consistent policy of being generally pro-Arabist and anti-Israeli.
I think that's a fair take. I would comment that it's not useful at all to separate the State Department as if it were somehow autonomous from the executive. It is not. The head of the State Department is an appointed employee. The president picks and chooses who he wants on that job. And if the presidents that come and go had different opinions, they would impose them on the State Department. So I think the consistency you see is a consistency that has carried over from one administration to the next, regardless of whether the president is Democratic or Republican, because in fact the ideology at the very top of U.S. society, the U.S. ruling elite, concerning Israel is the same. They all agree that they don't want Israel in the Middle East, in my view.
Well, let's go back to the time of partition, because obviously British politics played a role in the creation of the State of Israel. It would seem like we had the Balfour Declaration, but then Britain pretty rapidly wanted to backpedal on that one.
Well, there is a general perception in the media space, in the modern media space, that educates millions of people, that the United States and Britain somehow acted as uncles of the State of Israel, that they were the midwives of the creation of the State of Israel, and without their support, Israel would not have been created. Now, this is an impression that it's very important to correct. In point of fact, Great Britain, and I should make a parenthesis here to say that everything I'm about to say is documented on historical and investigative research, which is our website, www.hirhome.com. So at the time of the vote at the UN, Great Britain, in fact, abstained. They did not vote in favor. The government was actually opposed to the creation of the State of Israel, but they were too embarrassed to actually vote against, so they abstained.
Francisco, I hate to interrupt. We're up for a station break and news at the top of the hour. We're discussing with Professor Francisco Gil-White whether or not the U.S. is Israel's best ally, or has been. We're at steelon.steel.com. I'm John Lefter. The program is Steel on Steel.
This has been Steel on Steel with John Leffler, an alternative information source for politics, religion, and global events. Steel on Steel is produced by Carol Leffler, engineered by Glenn Meyer. The views and opinions expressed on this broadcast are not necessarily those of the staff, management, owners, or advertisers of this radio station. Steel on Steel can be heard 24 hours a day on the internet at steelonsteel.com. Tapes or online subscriptions support the ongoing program production. For more information, call toll-free 1-800-829-5646. That's 1-800-829-5646. This is the Steel on Steel Radio Consortium.
Just getting warmed up on the topic which I have selected for the last part of the show today. Has the U.S. been, or is it, the best ally of Israel? And my guest is a gentleman with whom I've been having a lot of converse, Dr. Francisco Gil-White. An interesting gentleman. He does have a website. It's hirhome.com. Most of the site is in English. There are parts of it which are in Spanish. He was born in Chicago, but raised in Mexico City. He's joining us right now from Mexico City by Skype. And as we went into the break, Francisco, you were saying that when the partition vote was held in the United Nations, Britain was against it. They were too embarrassed to vote for it, so they just abstained during the vote. Now, what about the United States?
The entire State Department, to the last man practically, was opposed to the creation of the State of Israel. It is true that Truman eventually ordered the U.S. ambassador at the UN to vote in favor of the creation of the partition of British Mandate Palestine into a Jewish and Arab state. However, the reason for that vote in favor from the U.S. was that at the UN General Assembly, Andrei Gromyko, who was the Russian ambassador to the UN, gave a dramatic, passionate speech in favor of the creation of the State of Israel, of a state for the Jewish people, explaining that the Russian people understood the suffering of the Jewish people in World War II because they had suffered tremendously as well. And he found it incredible that anybody could question the wisdom and the necessity of creating a state where Jews could find a refuge and take care of themselves. And after that very dramatic speech, it became really impossible within the political grammar of the developing Cold War, which was just beginning, which was a tremendously consequential prestige contest between the USSR and the United States, to oppose the creation of the State of Israel. Because then if the United States had voted against, or even if they had abstained, so in the context of the prestige contest between the USSR and the USA, it was very difficult after Gromyko's speech to vote against or even abstain when the question of partition came up. So Truman was caught between a rock and a hard place and had to order the U.S. ambassador to vote in favor. But the true intentions and the true goals and values and predilections of the U.S. ruling elite would soon become very obvious, because after the vote in favor at the UN, the Arab states, led by Azam Pasha, who was Secretary General of the Arab League, announced that they were not interested in an Arab state in what had been British Mandate Palestine. The Palestinian leadership said the same thing. What they wanted to do was to exterminate the Israeli Jews. And they publicly claimed that this was the goal of the war that they immediately launched in 1948. Now, in the first months of that war, it seemed that the Arabs were going to win. Things were not going very well for the Israeli Jews. And it was precisely in that context that the U.S. announced in public that they were renouncing their recognition of the State of Israel, and they also placed an arms embargo on the Israelis, which made it very difficult for them to defend themselves. Great Britain's behavior was even more dramatic. They supplied the Arabs with weapons, and they also sent captured German Nazi officers to lead the Arab armies that tried to exterminate the Israeli Jews in the War of 1948. All of this, by the way, was documented with secret documents obtained from French and British intelligence by the nation right at the time as these events were unfolding.
Yeah, you're talking about the magazine, by the way.
The Nation, that's correct. So I would say that the balance of the evidence, in my view, does not suggest in any way that the creation of the State of Israel was a gift from the United States and Great Britain to the Middle Eastern Jews. On the contrary, they did quite a lot to try and impede the creation of that Jewish state.
Why would it be that the elites have this antagonism towards the idea of a Jewish state?
Well, I think there are two questions in what you are asking, John. I think one question is, are they anti-Semites? But even if we answer yes, the next question would be, why are they anti-Semites? Okay, what is the source of anti-Semitism? Because pointing out that people are anti-Semitic is not really the end of the explanation. We want to know where this phenomenon comes from. So I would say yes. I would say that the ruling classes of the West have traditionally been anti-Semitic, and I don't think modern times are the exception. As we've been saying, it is my position that the perception that the U.S. ruling elite is pro-Israel and pro-Jewish, etc., is a media mirage created simply by repetition and not on the basis of anything having to do with historical fact. And I think that the reason that they are is the same reason that ruling elites in the West have been anti-Semitic for 25 centuries. And that reason is that the Jewish people invented something that I like to call the liberal left, to distinguish it from the communist left, which is a very different thing. The Jewish people invented the liberal left. Why do I say that? Because Jewish tradition revolves around the law of Moses. And the law of Moses, according to the tradition recorded in the Exodus, was born in a slave revolt. And I don't think this is an inconsequential detail. The fact that the law of Moses was born in a revolt of the Israelites against Pharaoh, who had enslaved them, and that it is given to the Jewish people right after they achieve freedom, is very significant, because it points to the fact that this is a law for a society of escaped slaves. It is the law of the escaped slaves, and the design of the law is to produce a utopian society where ordinary people, the people on the base of the pyramid of society, can no longer be oppressed. And therefore, the law of Moses protects with exquisite care the most vulnerable people in society. So this is a law that is not convenient to those in the ruling classes who would like to oppress and repress the lower classes and enslave them. And for that reason, for 25 centuries, starting with the Greco-Macedonians and ending with modern fascists, we find that those who would enslave all of us have a special animosity against the Jews and try to eradicate the religion, sometimes by eradicating the people, so that non-Jews will not discover in the law of Moses the fact that they have rights and that they should be free and that the law should protect them.
What I wanted to do is to jump forward to the June 67 war, and especially the Yom Kippur War, where a lot of times you have the idea that the U.S. bailed Israel out of certain disaster there, especially in the Yom Kippur War. In reality, as I read it, they almost let them go over the edge, but for a few factors.
Well, yeah, when you look at the details of the actual foreign policy at the time, it doesn't look as pro-Israel as you might think on the basis of what you keep hearing in the media and in regular university courses. Actually, for years prior to the 1967 war, there had been terrorist attacks against Israeli civilians from both the Jordanian and the Syrian borders. And Nasser was very actively promising that the Egyptians would carry out genocide. Well, not just the Egyptians, but the United Arabs would carry out a genocide of the Israeli Jews. And when you examine the behavior of the United States in the 1967 war, you keep finding facts that do not fit very well with this idea that they were the knight in shining armor coming to defend the Jews. First of all, look at the aftermath. Immediately after the 1967 war, the United States carried out a Pentagon study to evaluate the security situation of the Jewish state. This Pentagon study concluded that in the long run, Israel cannot survive without the territories captured in the 1967 war, especially important among them Gaza, Judea and Samaria, and the Golan Heights. But the same country that carried out that Pentagon study, the United States, or rather its government, immediately began pressuring Israel to let go of those territories conquered in the 67 war. So that doesn't gel very well with the idea that they're protecting Israel, because the best way to protect Israel, of course, is to keep Sinai. But that's precisely the territory that Israel, as a result of U.S. diplomacy, ended up ceding back to Egypt in exchange for what? In exchange for a piece of paper that promises not to attack Israel, which is not even worth its weight. And what Egypt got was funding from the U.S., which is spent almost entirely on weaponry, which ascends to 2/3 of the support that Israel gets from the U.S. So it's not clear in the aftermath of the war that the U.S. was protecting Israel. Now, what about right before the war? As you pointed out, it was only at the last minute that there was any semblance of U.S. support. And this came in very, very late. So this can be interpreted two different ways. One can be interpreted that one thing that we can't forget when we're analyzing geopolitical behavior is that the people who make these state-level decisions are always operating within a political grammar. What does that mean? It means that there are certain things that they have to do, no matter what they would like to do, because of the ideas that millions of people have in their heads and the political consequences of offending them. And so, for example, since the French Revolution in the West, the political grammar makes it absolutely obligatory for any leader of any Western modern liberal state to say that they are governing in favor of the people, all right, that they are trying to solve the people's problems, et cetera, et cetera. This kind of language is perfectly obligatory. There's nothing else that they may say in public. Therefore, it doesn't inform us about their true intentions and values. Similarly, in the case of a very dangerous military situation with Israel, so many people in the United States support Israel that a policy that became too obviously anti-Israel in that context could have represented internal political problems for the U.S. ruling elite. So when we see the United States, or rather the ruling elite, doing something that may be interpreted as pro-Israel, we always have to factor in whether this is a true instance of trying to assist Israel, or whether this is simply the result of political pressures and the necessary appearance that they have to project.
There is the for public consumption, the FPC rules why things are done, and then there are always the real rules. And if you understand the real, as you call it, a vocabulary, basic rules under which they're functioning, that will tell you where they're headed.